Today we are talking with Aleksei Viktorovich Gusev. He's a professor at the Moscow Lomonosov University. He's deputy head in the Department of Political History and of History of Political Movements.
Sorry, Guillermo, not now. Now I just am associate professor. I used to be.
You used to be, okay. He's a scholar on the oppositionist movements in Soviet Russia in the 1920s and early 1930s. He's considered a world authority in his subject. He has written a PhD dissertation in 1996 on the history of the Trotskyist opposition in Soviet Russia in the 1920s and early 1930s. He has written also a book on Victor Serge. He has written also monographs and several works on Rosa Luxemburg, on also Victor Serge, and he's one of the scholars today in Russia, which specializes on the history of the Trotskyist opposition and the opposition to Stalinism in general. Recently, I heard that you are also editing a collection, an anthology on the democratic centralists, which were one of the opposition currents in Soviet Russia in the 1920s.
Yes, this is a project in process. So we are compiling documents and we are preparing this anthology. But I think this work is quite prolonged. And in a couple of years, I think it can be finished.
Together with Kevin Murphy from the US.
Yes.
Okay, and so I will begin talking with you about kind of in a biographical note. You were born during the times of the USSR, and you were raised during the times of the USSR. And how was it possible to get access to documents or knowledge about the Trotskyist opposition and Trotsky, or the opposition to Stalinism in general? I mean, I suppose maybe it was kind of easier during the times of the Mikhail Gorbachev in the 1980s. And maybe during the turn between the dissolution of the USSR and the early post-Soviet Russia. Was it possible to get access to such documents, or how was your experience about that? How could you get access to these documents, and how did you become interested in such a political movement?
In the late years of the Soviet Union and in the Perestroika years, I was first a senior school pupil and then a student of Faculty of History of Moscow State University. And this was a time of big changes in our society, in our country, and time, first of all, of ideological crisis of the Communist Party regime, because this official ideology, official version of Marxism-Leninism almost lost its credibility, and even those people who had to make a propaganda in favor of this ideology, they did not believe it themselves, and many of them became later anti-communists. And people began to look for alternatives. Political alternatives, social alternatives, and this Perestroika years, as a result of the reforms initiated by Gorbachev, was a time of intellectual and social awakening of people. So this looking for alternatives led people to different roads. For instance, official ideologies of the Communist Party in late 80s turned to such figures as Nikolai Bukharin. And Bukharin was seen as a predecessor of perestroika, of market socialism, and so on. And at the same time, first works of Trotsky and about Trotsky began to be published. But Trotsky did not fit well with official perestroika discourse, because Trotsky stood against not only Stalin personally, but against the system, against the ruling bureaucracy. And Gorbachev and his perestroika leaders, they were products of the same bureaucracy, so they were not comfortable with the figure of Trotsky. And for us young people at that time, Trotsky was seen as a kind of alternative, symbol of alternative, not only to Stalinist bureaucratic nomenclatura system, but also to the private capitalism, the transition to which began at that time. So I became interested in Trotsky, and I tried to find his works. At that time, they were published and accessible mainly in minutes of Communist Party congresses and conferences. They were published officially and in 20s and 30s, and under Khrushchev they were republished when the cult of personality was criticized. Also there were publications in the periodical press of 1920s, and I found with these sources for my study. And then during the internship, student internship in the Institute of Marxism-Leninism in Moscow, I found Bulletin of Opposition. And this was a great discovery, because it contained everything, yes, which could be seen as a reflection of Trotsky and opposition stances on different questions. And so I was able to write, first of all, my diploma paper devoted to the opposition of 1923, and then to prepare my PhD thesis devoted to the Trotskyist opposition in late 20s and early 30s. That meant opposition in underground and in exile, the period after expulsion of the opposition from the Communist Party. It was a completely unknown for scholars subject, because some works were published by Pierre Bruet in France, and León Trotsky and others, but he was based only on Trotsky archives in abroad, not in Soviet Union. And my work was based primarily on the declassified archival sources from Moscow archives, like the former archive of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. So that was my genesis as a Trotsky and opposition scholar.
Were there also other scholars during that time interested in the opposition, such as you? I know, for instance, there was Vadim Rogovin, and he was published here in the West, at least as far as I know, mostly in German and to a smaller extent in English. But here in the West, it is little known about the scholars. What were the Russian scholars writing at that time? Were there more scholars like you interested in the opposition?
No, it's interesting, first of all, how the conception of history of Trotskyism, history of opposition, and biography of Trotsky changed in our country. Under Stalin, as you know, Trotsky was considered an incarnation of evil, the so-called Antichrist, and the roots of all evil and so on, like demon, a devil. And Stalin, as early as in 1931, wrote that Trotskyist opposition was a vanguard of counter-revolution. And then, after Stalin, during Khrushchev and Brezhnev period, there was a official rethinking of this conception, and Trotskyist opposition was sent not to vanguard, but the rear guard of reaction. And there was a book by Mikhail Basmanov, an official historian, that had a title "In the Baggage Train of Reaction." So you see that the different approach. And during Perestroika, of course, during the process of rehabilitation of victims of Stalinism, Trotsky was recognized not as an enemy of Soviet people, Soviet power as before, but as one of the leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. But it's ironically, he turned from the demon of counter-revolution to the demon of revolution. General Dmitry Volkogonov, who was one of the ideologists of Gorbachev Perestroika, wrote an article and then a book about Trotsky, where he introduced this characterization, demon of the revolution. And this was received by the press, by media, and is widely used till now. So Trotsky became a symbol of this revolution for the sake of revolution, revolutionary extremist violence, permanent chaos, and so on and so forth. And this was an official conception. But at the same time, in late 80s and early 90s, especially from 1990, works of serious Russian and Ukrainian historians began to appear devoted to Trotsky. One of the first leading historians who turned to this problematic was Professor Viktor Danilov. Viktor Danilov was a leading Russian expert on agrarian history. He studied collectivization, development of agriculture, and so on. And he wrote in 1990 an article in one of the small journals, which was titled, "We began to understand Trotsky." We begin to understand Trotsky. And here he attacked some historiographical myths, like Trotsky as a predecessor to Stalin, Trotsky as a maniac of revolution who wanted to burn Russia into fire of world revolution, and so on and so forth. It's a short article. Also, such authoritative historians like Vladimir Startsev, Alexander Pantsov, Yuri Podshykoldin, they all published articles devoted to various aspects of the opposition of Trotsky and so on. This is the early 90s, and I was also involved in an international committee to study León Trotsky legacy, which was organized by some Russian scholars sympathetic to the left, like Professor Mikhail Vayeiko from the Institute of Economy and others, and also American colleagues and some American Trotskyists who also were very enthusiastic about about doing this research. And we organized several conferences devoted to Trotsky opposition. So in 1996, we published a book, and I was an editor with Mikhail Vayeikov, León Trotsky Legacy, History and Contemporary Significance. This was one of the first books devoted to Trotsky in post-Soviet times. Also, of course, we must note the contribution of Dr. Vadim Rogovin. Rogovin was not a professional historian. He was a sociologist, and he worked in the Institute of Sociology, and he did not actually use a lot of archival materials. His books are kind of historical publicistics. So it's mostly analysis, not introduction of new sources. But his contribution was to to bring together, to summarize almost all published materials about Trotsky. And he produced in 1990s, before he died in 1998, he produced 7 volumes. 7 volumes devoted to the history of opposition from 1923 to Trotsky death, Trotsky murder in 1940. So this is very important works as introduction to the subject. Of course, they have this weakness of not using a lot of materials, and also what I consider to be uncritical praise of Trotsky and some kind of modernization of Trotsky ideas. This one-sidedness. But nevertheless, I recommend to my students to read these books. And also, if we talk about years from 2000 until now, the most important work is produced by 2 historians, Russian historians, who now live in United States. It's Georgy Chernyavsky and Yuri Felshtinsky. In 2012, they published 3 volumes of biography of Trotsky. The first volume, Trotsky Revolutionary, the second volume, Trotsky Bolshevik, and the third volume, 4 volumes. Third volume is Trotsky Oppositionist, and then 4th volume is Enemy Number 1. They also used many sources and interesting materials, but mainly sources and documents from American archives and Harvard archive and Stanford archives, not many materials from Russian archives. And these authors, they also had the ideological bias opposite to Rogovin. They judged Trotsky from liberal point of view.
Okay.
This also the weakness of this book, not very objective. And there are other younger students and researchers who work now in this field. I can mention Alexander Reznik, who defended a PhD and then produced a book based on this PhD, a book about Trotsky and comrades. That was the title, devoted to the opposition of 1923 and various aspects of this discussion, which marked the birth of the left opposition. Vladislav Shabalin, our colleague from Perm, who wrote and published in 2003 very interesting small book about opposition in Urals, because he lives in Urals and he used this local archives and local materials. Very interesting. Opposition in Urals from 27 till early 30s. Mikhail Vayeikov, he is already mentioned by me. He belongs to the older generation, but he still writes on this subject, and he analyzes Trotsky mostly from economic point of view, because he is an economist and he leads the political economy sector of the Institute of Economy of Russian Academy of Science. So his focus is on economic views of Trotsky. And also some former students and young PhD students like Dmitry Apalkov from Moscow State University, my close colleague, who just defended his thesis on the development of inner party struggles in 20s and 30s. He also devotes a big part of his research to the left communist opposition. But I must admit that not many people are working in this field. This is not very popular field. You see that historiography reflects the ideological climate in society and the what we call social order from authorities. And now the official discourse in Russia is conservative. And the ruling party, United Russia, is officially conservative party. So they tend to support works on Pyotr Stolypin and so on and so forth, not on Trotsky. So I wish...
And the series about Trotsky is kind of a reflection of this ideological climate. The series in Channel 1 in Russia, which was broadcasted here in the West in Netflix. No?
Yes, it's interesting, the official attitude to Trotsky now, because you see in 1990s we had development of two narratives concerning Trotsky and opposition. One liberal and one Russian nationalist, right-wing conservative. For liberals, he was a ultra-revolutionary and enemy of democracy and so on. For nationalists, he was a cosmopolitan, the Jewish commissar who was
complete anathema. Complete anathema. A Jewish commissar ruling Russia is complete anathema.
Yes, yes. So Jewish commissar is very, very bad, and the Putin, all the two these narratives combined actually. That Trotsky, yes, is seen as a incarnation of forces which are hostile to Russia, hostile to great Russian statehood. Because the official narrative is the basic idea of ideology of Putinism is the continuity of Russian tradition and Russian statehood. Yes, from all princes, ancient Russian princes to Putin actually, and the positive appraisal of Stalin, Ivan the Terrible, czars and general secretaries of the Communist Party, with one break in this continuity. That's a revolution. The revolution is bad. What was before and after, good. The revolution itself bad. And Trotsky is the symbol of the revolution. So before that, in Soviet times, Trotsky was considered an enemy of revolution, and he was attacked for that. Now he is a leading figure of the, and he is attacked for that. And if you did you see this series Trotsky, which is on Netflix?
Yeah, I've seen it.
No, what you can understand what I mean. That Trotsky makes the October Revolution, not Lenin. Lenin is secondary. It's Trotsky who is leading it. And
it kind of fits in the narrative of the Jews made a revolution. The Jews really made a revolution. Yeah.
No, in this movie there is, I think, no direct anti-Semitic tones, but of course sapienti sat. Yes, and why Trotsky became so unrooted and cosmopolitan, and he did not like Russia? Because of that, yes, and this is the logic of the people who watch this and other films. But we can also mention other films which are demonstrated on the Russian TV, like the Secrets of the World Revolution, or Golden Key of the World Revolution. This exploits the conception that all revolutions are made by foreign intelligence, foreign agents, and so on. This is all, of course, politicized, because for the current Russian regime, the fear of revolution, the fear of democratic movement is very real. And they see that the democratic revolutionary movements in other countries of post-Soviet space, and they're afraid of the same happening in Russia. So they have to demonize the very conception of revolution. Revolution is Trotskyism. Trotskyism is bad. Trotskyism and revolution are paid by foreign bankers, foreign authorities, intelligence, and so on. You see in these Trotsky movies, which you mentioned, there is a figure of Parvus. And Parvus actually manipulates revolutionaries. Parvus, it's absolutely fantastic. Parvus works for Japanese, for Germans, even in Revolution of 1905, which is which is absolutely fantastic,
Impossible.
impossible invention. Par was bought for Trotsky mandate of the delegate of the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Party. Absolutely crazy. And, and so on. So this conception of the foreign interference is very important. And this is much more openly stated in so-called documentary films. Because what I said, it's the secrets of world revolution, golden key of the world revolution, all the so-called documentaries. So people have to believe that it was real. And they produced by a group of openly monarchists, directors and producers, like Yelena Chavchavadze and some others, who believed that Tsar was killed by some Jewish conspiracy and so on. So all this is officially invented, propagated now in Russia. And the Trotsky series is not actually the worst among these problems.
Wow.
That's the situation.
When I was in Moscow in 2017, and I went to the Vedenha, to the park in Moscow, which is an old Soviet park, and I saw a multimedia history museum devoted to the history of Russia, and I noticed that there was no mention, there was almost no mention of 20th century Russia except for some white army generals, but there wasn't even, as far as I could see, not even Stalin. They erased completely. They erased the revolution completely.
No. Now they have a 1/3 of this exhibition. That's called Russia My History Park, and 1/3 of this exhibition is devoted to Soviet period. No, the conception is that revolution bad, Jewish commissars, but then good Stalin arrived, shot all these Jews, and recreated the greatest Russian empire under red flag. It's very short conception of this. And this is organized by a priest, Orthodox priest called Tikhon Shevkunov, who is the spiritual father of Putin. And he overviewed this all this project of the Russia My History. And as regards Trotsky, of course, he is evil in this exhibition. And they even used false quotations from Trotsky. Because they explain these quotations on the walls, and some of them were false. And it's also circulation of false quotation of Trotsky is typical for Russia in the internet and publications and so on. Like, we Jews wanted to establish our yoke over Russia and so on and so forth, with false references to some kind of communist newspapers. And serious historians know that this is all false. But nevertheless, these falsifications continue to be reproduced.
Okay, and what could you tell us about current research on the Trotsky's opposition? For example, we have translated and published in our journal the work of Alexander Fokin about the Верхний Урals notebooks of the Trotskyists from that region in the south of Russia, which were their notebooks were found by chance, by accident, inside a prison almost 3 years ago, I guess. And Fokin is digitalizing these notebooks from the prison archives and uploading them to the internet. And what do you know about this research? And
I'm actually head of the group of historians who are making all this, and Alexander Fokin is a part of this collective. And we are working to produce, first of all, in digital form, as a publication on the web, the collection of these documents. And this, we are planning to do this by the end of this year. And then we are going to publish it in printed form, but we are looking for various practical ways to do that. We digitalized, first of all, about 30 documents, so-called notebooks of the Verkhny Urals, Upper Urals political isolator. These documents were found, as you said, in 2018 during the repair works in the old prison in Verkhny Uralsk. This is the small town in the Urals, where there was a political prison in late 20s and 30s. And in this prison, various political enemies of the regime were held, like socialists, anarchists, nationalists, and also a biggest part of prisoners were communists of various tendencies, Trotskyists, democratic centralists, workers group, it's the left communists, and so on. And this discovery contained documents produced by one of the Trotskyist faction, which exists, because they also had different factions, which fought, which is typical for Trotskyist movement till now. And one of these factions, which produced the journal Bolshevik Leninist, they had the archive, and we found this archive, and we are working with this archive. Very interesting works. And I also published an article devoted to the attitude of opposition to the collectivization. You, I think, translated it, and this was partially based on these documents. And we see that the criticism on this particular aspect, we see that the criticism of Trotskyists of the Stalinist policy was much more sharp than Trotsky himself, because Trotsky considered this to be contradictory, on one hand reactionary, on the other hand progressive. The group of Trotskyists, they attacked it without any hesitations as a crime against workers, against peasants, and they called for the all kinds of methods of resistance to Stalinism, not excluding the armed resistance. And this was the early 30s. So it was close to, it was, I think, the even more radical position than position of Martin Jan Rutin and his Union of Marxist-Leninists, which is much more known. Much more known in Russia. It's the former right opposition. So we also can see in these documents the Trotskyist attitudes towards development of political system in Soviet Union, the discussion if any kind of dictatorship of the proletariat remained of the Soviet Union, what kind of political regime is there. What should be the attitude of opposition to the workers and peasants uprisings, like workers' demonstration in Ivanovo, which was shot by Stalinist police and so on. And also their attitude to theoretical questions. They debate the conception of permanent revolution and their contemporary implications. Problems of the international workers' movement, Comintern policy, in particular, the Hitler taking power in Germany, and this part of these documents were published also by Fokin. So this is very, very interesting and important documents. I think the collection of this with our commentaries and with biographies of the authors should be important for historiography of the problem.
When I first read the documents, I was astonished how did these isolated groups, these imprisoned groups, manage to get hold of the international situation, to get so much information, to exchange all this information between the different groups. How could they do this? How could they manage to do that? I was really astonished.
You see, this was early 30s, and this was not Gulag of 1937. The extermination camps, actually, where people died, I mean, thousands and hundreds of thousands. This was political isolator for political prisoners. Till mid-30s, political prisoners in Soviet Union had a special status, and they were not mixed with common criminals and sent to build channels and so on, but they were kept in this special political prisons where they had relatively free conditions. No, relatively, of course, because they also were sometimes beaten and searched and so on. But they could write, they could produce handwritten journals, platform, they could discuss, they could meet in the prison yards during their walks. Twice a day they had walks and they could meet and discuss. And so it was very interesting. The small islands of freedom in unfree country, and this is described by Ante Ciliga in his memoirs. Yugoslavian communist who also was on this Verkhney Uralsk as a later. When he arrived, he was completely shocked by how it's possible to have this parliament of Russia in miniature under prison bars. Was it a miracle or the madhouse? But this existed till mid-30s. In mid-30s, after Kirov murder, they, of course, this relative freedom ended, and political prisoners of communist opposition were first sent to Gulag, and then almost everybody was killed, was shot. And I'm preparing now an article about fate of some of these prisoners, communist opposition, and yes, and I found that about 98% of these people were shot during the Great Terror. Even only few people survived by accident, because Stalin had an attitude to Trotsky as Hitler to Jews. Stalin ordered final solution, so everybody had to be killed, and they were killed by machine guns, from 200 to 300 a day on Kolyma and Vorkuta. And this was the tragedy that ended the life of these people.
Until how far in the 1940s, or I don't know, perhaps 1950s, did the opposition survive or manage to survive in the camps? Was there any trace of the opposition left in the 1940s, or
only few people without any kind of communications between each other. As political current, this was completely exterminated. Some of former oppositionists during the Second World War, they had a chance to escape the Soviet Union, and they went to abroad, and some of them, for instance, in the United States or in France, they left their memoirs, very interesting things. And those who stood in Soviet Union, for instance, Dashkovsky, Isaac Dashkovsky, who was the one of the leading democratic centralists, he survived, and he in 50s wrote to leaders of the Communist Party, to Pravda newspaper, letters demanding rehabilitation of opposition. But all people after decades in Gulag, they were not capable of doing any kind of political work. Younger people who participated in opposition, they participated also in some kind of dissident movements, like Zimin or Leikin, his real name, who wrote very interesting works about the nature of Communist Party and political regimes, published in the Russian language in France. So this manuscript was sent abroad and published there, like Roots of Stalinism and Socialism and Neo-Stalinism. I don't know if this is known in your country or abroad.
No, no,
This works, but
no, not really.
he was very young student when he was in a position, but then he became a kind of socialist dissident. The same is Mikhail Baitalsky, who wrote interesting memoirs. And of course, we should mention Varlam Shalamov. Varlam Shalamov was an activist of the Trotskyist opposition, and he was taken by GPU when he distributed oppositional leaflets sent to camps, and then he went out of camps only in 50s, and he became one of the biggest Russian writers of the 20th century. And his writings on camps are much more powerful than Solzhenitsyn. But he is known less than Solzhenitsyn, but he deserves to be known more, actually.
Sure.
No, he did not continue any kind of political activities. Many of oppositionists, they rethought their conceptions, and some of them went to social democracy, others to just the democratic movement. Some of them participated in Jewish movements and so on. But again, this is few people, only few people.
Was there, for instance, in the underground writings like the samizdat movement, was there anything left of these old Trotskyist opposition or these old ideas in the underground writings during the 1960s or 1970s, or
no direct continuity. As I said, there was this Zemin publications, which were, I think, they were published in France by the Trotskyist publishing house called Slovo, and they were distributed in samizdat. And also memoirs of Boyarchikov and some other oppositionists, they were distributed in samizdat, and then they were republished in English by George Sanders, by the Voices of the Left Opposition, I think in the late 70s. Very interesting collections. But indirect influence, of course, can be seen in dissident movement of 50s and 60s. Not till the mid-60s, dissident movement in Soviet Union was mostly socialist, communist. They were for real Leninism, against Stalinist betrayal and so on. And only from the second half of the 60s, it became, the liberal democratic and human rights currents became predominant in this movement, especially after Czechoslovakia crisis, when the dreams and hopes for the socialism with the human faces became very weak. But yes, also we can say about Medvedev's brothers, who published a political diary magazine. They were not Trotskyists, they were critical, they were more sympathetic to Bukharin, but they also contributed to maintain memory of the opposition and Trotsky. And the Trotskyist movement in the Soviet Union actually began to appear only in 90s. Actually, in 1990, there was a first open meeting of Trotskyists in Moscow in the Sputnik Hotel. So now we will have the we will mark the how many years now? It's 40 years, 30 years of this. It was in August 1990, actually, when American, German, and some other Trotskyists, British, first of all, Trotskyists, came to Moscow with small pamphlets by Trotsky, republished on the Bulletin of Opposition in Russia, and they met with the young people, young activists of the oppositional movements, and there became, there was the this gave an impulse to creation of the first Trotskyist groups. 1990, and between 30s and 1990,
Wow.
nothing.
Very, very, very long time. Such a long time. Okay, well, thank you for talking with us. It has been very nice, very interesting for us to have a look. A lot of things we don't know here in the West from scholarship about the dissidents, about the Soviet opposition, about Trotskyism in Russia, and well, we are eagerly waiting for your articles and all the Russian scholarship about this subject to appear and to go on translating it to a Western audience, primarily Spanish language audience, but also in the English language and other languages here in our journal. Well, thank you, Aleksei.
Yeah.
And,
thank you, Guillermo. Thank you very much for this interview and for your work for making familiar of the international readers with our works by translating and publishing our research. And I hope we will continue and develop our cooperation.
Okay, до встречи.
До встречи.